In 2010, I was serving the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Restoration in Philadelphia. The church is now known as the Unitarian Universalists of Mount Airy. One day I received a call from a man named George Kalman. George Kalman was a filmmaker who was suing the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania for denying his application for a business license because he wanted to call his business I Choose Hell Productions, LLC. Pennsylvania law prohibited business names that constitute, and I quote, blasphemy, profane cursing or swearing, or that profane the Lord's name. Now, which Lord is always to be questioned in that. But Mr. Kalman wanted to make films that acknowledged that life was hard, but persuaded people suffering from depression not to commit suicide. He chose the name of his production company because he wanted those who felt life was hell to choose to live with hell and continue to live as he had. Not the words that I might have chosen, but I have never lived with extreme depression as Mr. Kalman has. Pennsylvania had determined that his production company's name was blasphemous and refused to issue Mr. Kalman a license. The reason that Mr. Kalman was calling me was because I was the minister of a Unitarian Universalist church that descended from the Universalist church that Abner Kneeland had once served in Philadelphia. Abner Kneeland was the last person in the United States to be jailed for the crime of blasphemy. Mr. Kalman was asking me to become an amicus curiae, friend of the court, and support him in his lawsuit. I told him that I would. I signed and returned documents when I received them. When researching the sermon, I turned to a listing on Wikipedia. Sometimes I don't just go to Wikipedia to find out some information, and I know it sometimes is biased for one reason or another. But I would turn to an article titled Blasphemy Laws in the United States and discovered that on June 30th, 2010, Mr. Kalman won his case in the Eastern Regional Court of Pennsylvania. The anti-blasphemy statute was ruled unconstitutional as it violated both the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. Embedded in the footnotes on Wikipedia for the case was my legal record as a friend of the court defending Mr. Kalman's right to name his company when he wanted to. It was humbling to see my name listed in Kalman versus Cortez documents, and I signed them for religious liberty and the memory of Abner Kneeland. So if you want to research blasphemy laws in the United States, go to Wikipedia to find your minister listed. That may be my claim to fame, is defending blasphemy, and not something most clergy can say. Next Friday is International Blasphemy Day. It is also Universalist Day, but those two are not connected other than in the person of Abner Kneeland. Blasphemy Day is a day to educate individuals and groups about blasphemy laws and defend freedom of expression, especially open criticism of religion, which is criminalized in many countries. Blasphemy Day was introduced as a worldwide commemoration by the Center for Inquiry in 2009. So when it gets to be September the 30th, live it up. It helps to understand the difference between blasphemy and heresy. In Christianity, blasphemy has points in common with heresy, but it is differentiated from it, and heresy consists of holding a belief contrary to the orthodox view. Thus, it is not blasphemous to deny the existence of God. or to question the established tenets of Christian faith unless it is done in a mocking and derisive spirit. The mocking or derisive spirit is what distinguishes blasphemy. And Abner Kneeland certainly committed blasphemy. He had many good points and was much ahead of his time, but the way that he presented his points was like got him into trouble with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. His life began humbly, and no one who knew him imagined this direction it would take when he was younger. He was born in 1774 in Gardner, Massachusetts, the son of a carpenter. As a young man, he taught school in Dummerston, Massachusetts. He was immersed as a Baptist. He became a late Baptist preacher, but as rumors of his heretical views became known, he was tried for heresy. He converted thereafter to Universalism, his sister's faith. He was fellowshipped in 1803 with Hosea Ballou, the most prominent Universalist minister of his time, leading the sermon. He was called to the Universalist Church of Langton, New Hampshire in 1805 after serving as an itinerant preacher for a year and a half. He was elected to the state legislature of New Hampshire for 2 years. In 1811, he served the Universalist Church of Charlestown, Massachusetts. With Ballou, Kneeland compiled the first Universalist hymnal. In 1813, he married a wealthy widow and left the ministry to open a dry goods store in Salem, Massachusetts. When the dry goods store went bust, Kneeland returned to a ministry serving in Whitestown, New York. From there, he accepted the call to the Lombard Street Universalist Church in Philadelphia. In accepting the call, he reserved the right to interpret for himself their articles of faith. It was in part of his contract. He served 7 years, and during that time became the editor of the Philadelphia Universalist magazine. His Philadelphia church expanded enough that they started a second congregation, the one later known as the Unitarian Universalist, the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Restoration, and now the Mount Airy Unitarian Universalists. During this time, Kneeland published a New Testament Greek and English translation of the Bible. The American Pronouncing Spelling Book was also one of his publications, which sought to help children learn to pronounce English words, and a book advocating changing spoken words to represent the sounds they actually made. In 1825, Kneeland accepted the call to the Prince Street Universalist Society in New York City. This became his first significant conflict. Kneeland's skepticism about Christianity and the scriptures and his political and social radical views became more evident. He was becoming aligned with the free thought movement. It took fewer than 2 years for his ministry there to end. He and members of the church did establish the Second Universalist Society and met in different buildings in the city. Soon he was ejected by the leaders of the congregation he had founded. His radical views led him to be disfellowshipped by the New York Universalist Convention. In 1833, Kneeland was asked by renowned Universalist minister Thomas Whittemore if he would start a Universalist. Kneeland wrote an article explaining that he was not a Universalist because he no longer believed in the Universalist God, or Christ, or in miracles, or in the resurrection of the dead to eternal life. This response was published in the Compass, a Universalist magazine that Whittemore edited. Around the time that Kneeland was dismissed from the Second Universalist Society, he began to associate with radicals like Robert Owen and Fanny Wright. They were hated because they spoke in favor of equal rights for women, African Americans, children, and working people, and because they were agnostics who denigrated religion and socialists who divided the rich, and because they were in favor of the right to divorce, and because Robert Owen published a tract tract explaining birth control. Remember, these were positions in the 1830s. In some communities, some of these positions still retain some of their radical nature, even today. Owen and Wright made Kneeland the president of the Association for the Promotion of Industry and the Promotion of National Education, which called for a state guardianship plan wherein all children would be fed, clothed, and educated at public expense. Owen and Wright sent Kneeland to Boston to establish the Free Inquirer Society, whose purpose was the acquirement and diffusion of useful knowledge and the education of our children, without regard to religious opinions, orthodoxies, or creeds. In 1830, that community was the only entity in Boston to give abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison a place to speak about the end of slavery. The only place. It's pretty amazing. Even Unitarian churches found that too controversial in 1830. The next year, Kneeland established the Boston Investigator. That was a magazine, I don't remember how often it was published. Among the controversial opinions voiced were that women should be able to initiate romantic relationships, leading to marriage with men. Women's equal rights under the law. Women's wages should be equal to men's. Women should be able to keep their name and property in marriage, and the approval of interracial marriage. This is the 1830s. In 1833, Kneeland was indicted by a grand jury after charges were brought by some unidentified person by presenting a copy of the Boston Investigator. It's amazing that in those days you just have somebody indicted without actually having to name yourself under the law. The three charges that they were brought for Abner Kneeland were because he had written that Jesus was begotten without male genitalia, that God must be confused by conflicting prayers of believers. And the third charge was from the Trumpet magazine letter, in which Kneeland stated that he did not believe in the Universalist God. Abner Kneeland went through 5 trials for these charges. It took quite a long time for them. The first was in January 1834 with Judge Thatcher presiding and Samuel Proctor, district attorney, as the prosecutor. Dunlop, a Unitarian, and Kneeland's attorney took 3 days to present his defense and prosecution. It took the jury 5 minutes to come back with a guilty verdict. Judge Thatcher, also a Unitarian, sentenced Kneeland to 90 days in jail. Kneeland appealed, and the second trial, this time with Judge Putnam, took place in May 1834 and ended with the hung jury. The one holdout on the jury was a friend of Kneeland's attorney. Clearly, the legal system in Massachusetts at the time needed a lot of reform. The third trial in November 1834 also led to a hung jury. In the third trial, Kneeland argued his own defense because his attorney, Dunlap, had died between the trials. The fourth trial in 1835 was argued before the judges of the State Supreme Court of the Commonwealth, and Kneeland was found guilty. He appealed the verdict and argued again in March 1836. It took 2 years for the court to return a verdict, and Kneeland was summoned before the court and found guilty and served 60 days in jail for blasphemy. Some of the defenses that Kneeland's defense mounted were not sustainable, like the fact that 2 of the 3 charges came from articles published in New York and were therefore inadmissible as evidence, so they were outside the jurisdiction of the court. The claim that they were altered and not directly published by Kneeland, were also not sustainable as they were consistent with his public pronouncements. The charge about Jesus' manhood, I guess, and the conflicting prayers presented to God were really not the focus. The prosecution focused on Kneeland's statement that he did not believe in the universalist God. The defense argued that denying the universalist God did not mean denying God, merely the way that the universalists understood God. Samuel Parker, the district attorney, read Kneeland's writings about the rights of women to find that Kneeland was in favor of sexual immorality. He said, Abner Kneeland and his detestable dissemination of obscenity and impropriety and blasphemy may be considered from his acts and doctrines to be the common enemy of the human race. Parker also decried the lascivious and profligate who gathered at Reverend Kneeland's Wednesday night socials at the Federal Street Theater, where he had been informed of their events in the dressing rooms. Of course, in those days, theater troupes traveled from city to city. And they usually, when actors were in a town, they usually lived on premises of the theater. So having bedrooms in the back of the theater was not an unusual thing, but it sounded so very scandalous from Mr. Parker. The jury found Kneeland guilty, but the charge was appealed. And the first trial, Judge Thatcher, in his charge, told the jury to find Kneeland guilty. At the second trial, Judge Putnam did the same. Judge Wild did the same in the third trial. Most of the people in the legal system at that time were Unitarians, including the judges who charged the juries to convict Abner Kneeland. Just in case you think Unitarians are always very tolerant. Not so tolerant all the time. The district attorney, Parker, was the lone non-Unitarian. At the end of the third trial, William Ellery Channing, the leader of the American Unitarian Association, delivered a petition to the governor that requested Kneeland's unconditional pardon because he wrote, "Religion needs no support from penal law. Opinion should not be subjected to penalties. The assumption by the government of a right to prescribe or repress opinions has been the ground of the grossest deprivations of religion and of the most grinding despotisms. The freedom of speech and of the press is never to be restrained by legislation." I love Channing. He always gets to right to the source of things and says things so clearly. 168 people signed Channing's petition, including Theodore Parker, Ralph Waldo Elmerson, William Lloyd Garrison, and Bronson Alcott. Conservative clergy circulated a counter petition, and they got 230 signatures. This is, of course, a political matter, and whoever got the most signatures was going to win this one. In 1838, Kneeland finally served 60 days in jail. At age 64, he left jail a bitter and somewhat broken man. He met a crowd of 300 persons there to welcome him at the jail. He responded, "All I ask of you is to remember this when you go to the polls." See the importance of it again. The Free Thought Society decided to leave Boston for points west. They would establish a radical colony in Iowa. Abner put forth plans for Kneelandsville Academy, which would teach free thought in a community of thinkers. But that academy never came to fruition. His group settled in May of 1839 on the banks of the Des Moines River, about 2 miles south of Farmington. His followers were not farmers. The land was not great farmland. That place on the river was not ideal for boats to stop. They called the place Saluvia, but that community only lasted a few years. After that, Kneeland pursued local politics unsuccessfully. He traveled to Helena, Arkansas to teach school as he needed money. He befriended Native Americans. He lost all of his possessions and became poor. His home, though, was eventually a very happy place, and his granddaughter recounted that no bitterness was felt, but comfort that he had spoken the truth as he understood it. On August 27, 1844, Abner Kneeland died surrounded by his loving family. Our movement is the heir to Abner Kneeland's controversial heritage, as Calvin's connection with me grew. Though he disowned the universalism of his time, he is still someone we might consider a forerunner in our faith tradition. So many of the things that he said were going to be rights of women and rights of people of color and Native Americans are things that we recognize now as important points that they were considered so radical that they could not be spoken in the 1830s. His legacy serves to remind us that blasphemy and heresy have their place. Blasphemy is still not the best of us, as it mocks and derides the faiths of others. But what if the faith is truly terrible, or encourages acts that are unreasonable and brutish? All tyrants, whether persons, institutions, or ideas, fear blasphemy. They want fear and obedience, not to be seen as someone or something worthy of ridicule, even when they deserve what they deserve is to be exposed. The emperor has no clothes. Often the faith of individuals is guided by leaders, institutions, and ideas that betray them. I often think that many people have beliefs and traditions that they hold dear and in a pure form, but are betrayed by churches and church leaders that are wanting. It is the right of people to express their religious opinions derisively, even when I might not like what they say. I can also express my opinions as well in a free society and in this pulpit. On the contract this congregation has, I can say anything that I believe to be the truth from this pulpit. It's called the free pulpit in our tradition. But I will say things that are derisive or mocking. Blasphemy can be universal. Just listen to monologues by George Carlin. If you've ever heard of one, you've probably heard of two blasphemous things. It can be in bad taste. It can offend, and it is meant to do so. Sometimes a point can only be heard because its expression is offensive. As for Abner Kneeland, though he committed to blasphemy by the standards of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in his time, he retained theological views that would be more conventional among us now. Abner Kneeland denied being an atheist and stated that he viewed God differently. Abner Kneeland called himself a pantheist. It was an accurate description of what he believed in his lifetime. Today we might understand him as a religious naturalist or a pantheist or even possibly as a humanist, I don't know. But it seems fitting today to end with his philosophical creed from 1833, in which he explains the God in which he believes in the language of his times, and giving him the last word. And the last word, the words he spoke, were so important to him. So important that he was not able, but was sent to jail. These words are difficult sometimes to understand. I read this through and I don't always understand what Kneeland actually meant. But I want us to hear these words because this was his belief in God. And we'll follow these words with a moment of silence in his memory. He writes, I believe in the existence of a universe of suns and planets, among which there is one sun belonging to our planetary system, and that other suns, being more remote, are also called stars. But there are indeed suns to other planetary systems. I believe that the whole universe is nature, and that the word nature embraces the whole universe, and that God and nature, so far as we can attach any rational idea to either, are perfectly synonymous terms. Hence, I am not an atheist, but a pantheist. That is, instead of believing there is no God, I believe in the abstract all is God, and that all power, that is in God, and that there is no power except that which proceeds from God. I believe that there can be no will or intelligence where there is no sense where there are no organs of sense. And hence, sense, will, and intelligence is the effect, not the cause of the organization. I believe in all that logically results from these premises, whether good, bad, or indifferent. Hence, I believe that God is all in all, and that it is in God we live, move, and have our being. And that the whole duty of man, consists in living as long as he can and in promoting as much happiness as he can while he lives. Amen.